Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Roddy Gow from the Asia Scotland Institute, and we welcome you to this very interesting webinar in which Stephen King is going to talk about his book, We Need to Talk About Inflation. And this is a book that's been extraordinarily well received, which we will talk about. To explain to you all the format, we're using the Zoom platform, which means that your pictures can't be seen, but you can see us. Your microphones are suppressed, but you should use the WeChat or comments or Q&A functions for posting any questions you may have. And in the second half of this webinar, which will last an hour, we'll be taking your questions and hopefully providing some answers for you. So a little bit of background for you. Stephen King is extremely well known. If you haven't got it, you should get his book. The title's written backwards here, and I'm holding it up in America. But he was a senior economic advisor and still is to HSBC. And he's been a specialist advisor also to the House of Commons Treasury Committee. He has written a number of books, all of which, funnily enough, at the Asia Scotland Institute, or funnily enough, naturally, we have featured with him. Losing Control, When the Money Runs Out, and Grave New World. And so we're absolutely delighted to have him talking to us today. We're also thrilled that Poonam Gupta, who is the owner and chief executive of PG Paper and has been acknowledged as a leading entrepreneur based in Scotland, but doing a lot of business with and expanding the understanding of India, is with us to talk as we progress with Stephen about her views and her questions as someone running a highly successful business in a number of different countries around the world. So welcome to all of you who are listening, and to Stephen and to Poonam. I would just say perhaps in opening that none other than Larry Summers said about this book, most of those who have to deal with inflation are too young to remember when it was last a serious issue. This book teaches them what they need to know. King's lessons command our attention. And his namesake, but no relation, Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, says, everything you wanted to know about inflation, but were afraid to ask. This book is timely, well-researched, and very well written. Well, with endorsements like that, we can hardly say more. So, Stephen, can we set off by telling us perhaps why you wrote the book and what the key recent influences have been, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, thanks, Roddy, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's great to be discussing these issues, not just with Roddy, but with Poonam as well, who I think works in the real world. I work in the kind of imaginary world of economics. Why did I write the book? Well, I think it's fair to say that in the first half of 2021, so this is a year after the pandemic had begun, there was a sort of consensus view that said that inflation was not going to come back, that it was dead and buried, that the Western world was very much like Japan, because it had an aging population and high levels of debt and all those kinds of things. And therefore inflation couldn't really return. But what was odd about the early stages of 2021 was that even as levels of economic activity were hugely surprising on the downside, mostly because of lockdowns, inflation began to surprise on the upside, first of all in the US, and then shortly thereafter, both in the UK and the Eurozone. And the reason why these three areas matter is that initially, when the American inflationary surprises started to come through, it was very easy to say this was a consequence of the Biden fiscal stimulus, which of course would apply to the US, but would not apply to the Eurozone or the UK. So when you started to see inflation coming in on the other side of the Atlantic, on this side of the Atlantic, it became rather clearer that this was a transatlantic phenomenon rather than specifically an American phenomenon. And as time went by, the inflation numbers just got worse and worse. It wasn't just a case of a few limited goods rising in price. Most obviously, these were things like semiconductors and secondhand cars. But as 2021 progressed, you start to see a lot of other price increases coming through across a wider and wider range of goods, and then services, and then wages. And before you knew it, you had what appeared to be a much more deeply embedded inflationary problem. But even then, I would say that a lot of policymakers are still in denial, effectively arguing that inflation was transitory or temporary, that it would disappear as quickly as it had arrived. And there was no real reason to tighten monetary policy. So I thought these were sort of surprising events, needed an explanation. And so I started thinking about how I might write a book that would be an explanation of this. And as the book developed, it wasn't just a story about what had happened over the last 2 or 3 years, but also I thought it'd be worth exploring what had happened over the last 2,000 years, because there was such a rich history of inflation and inflationary problems that I felt we could use history to learn something about some of the risks we are facing in the here and now. And throughout the book, there's sort of historical examples ranging from the Romans to the French Revolution to the American Civil War, all of which have some kind of resonance for where we are at the moment. But the bottom line, I think, is this: that first of all, people underestimated the inflation problem. That in turn meant that they underestimated how much monetary policy would have to be tightened. Now that monetary policy has been tightened quite a long way, in fact, the big debate now is, for how long will this inflation last, and what are the costs of getting rid of it? And in the UK, as an obvious example, there's a lot of debate now about whether the inflation problem that we're witnessing today will be replaced by a recession problem at some point in the future, or in the worst of all worlds, you could have them coexisting, where a bit like the 1970s, in terms of stagflation, you could possibly have inflation being too high and economic growth being too low at the same time, which would not be a happy situation to be in.
Stephen, the piling on of debt and costs, particularly as a result of COVID with the furlough payments, and then, if you like, the compounding of the economic situation by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those seem to be two events in pretty close conjoined that will have exaggerated any situation.
Yeah, they absolutely have, and I think that certainly if you look at the situation with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's an obvious reason why inflation shot up so much through the latter stages of 2022 and the first half of this year. But what I think is striking is that the inflationary problems were there before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And to that extent, the Russian invasion was a kind of useful excuse, a helpful sort of ex-post excuse for what had already happened. And if I'm sort of thinking, why is it that inflation's picked up? I think, Roddy, you're absolutely right that the COVID story, the invasion story are two parts of that story. But the third part of it, as you've already hinted at, is the extraordinary amount of stimulus that came through in 2020, 2021, and in a way that actually I think a lot of policymakers didn't themselves fully recognize. So to put it very simply, there was a huge amount of fiscal stimulus for good reasons, and there was a huge amount of monetary stimulus for bad reasons, the wrong reasons. And the amount of money that was printed through 2020 and the early stages of 2021 meant that a lot of people had a lot of extra cash that they didn't know what to do with. In some cases, if you happen to have invested in the stock market, you'd have seen tremendous gains coming through, even as the economy was collapsing. And so when lockdowns came to an end, people were in an unusually strong position to spend money, even though the global economy, from a sort of supply perspective, had not returned to how it had been before the COVID pandemic. So put those things together, you basically have too much money chasing too few goods, which is a sort of classic definition in one sense of an inflationary problem.
Yeah. The other point I think you make several times in the book is that it's the attitudes of people that are impactful too, towards central government, towards the major central banks, whether they're trusting in them or not. And that appears to have varied over time.
Yes. So trust is a really important part of the story. And I think that policymakers sort of underestimate this at their peril sometimes. So I suppose nowadays you talk about trust in terms of credibility. Is the policy credible or not, as the case may be? But the credibility of policy itself can change in response to new economic realities. And what's been striking over the last 2 or 3 years is that we've had a persistent period of inflation being higher than expected. We had a persistent period of central banks trying to explain it away and say it was only temporary. But the more that inflation persisted, the more the public, I think, began to believe, well, actually, we're no longer sure we should believe what the central bank is telling us. Okay, they're telling us that inflation will be back down to 2% in a year or 2 years' time. But what matters to me today is what's happened to inflation already over the last 2 or 3 years, And this gives rise to the so-called second round effects that the Bank of England has been talking about recently. So this is things like wage increases, or from a corporate perspective, some people call it greedflation, but whatever it is, there are certainly knock-on effects from COVID or from the energy price shock that have begun to percolate through to the broader economy. And going back through history, there are plenty of examples of where trust breaks down and the monetary or fiscal authority loses its authority. So actually, during the French Revolution, there was all sorts of monetary experiments taking place, which might seem entirely benign nowadays, in particular, printing of cash really for the first time. But the public couldn't get their heads around it. It was too easy to counterfeit this stuff. As a consequence, people wanted to get rid of the cash as fast as possible. And it's not just that you print a lot of it, it's that if people don't trust it and want to get it out of their hands as quickly as possible, then that process of circulating money faster and faster into the economy itself can be inflationary. So lots of examples from the past where it's not just printing money or coin clipping or currency debasement that matters, but also this idea that the public give up in believing what the authorities have told them.
I'm going to ask Poonam to come in a minute, but since this is the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, and I think it was a Scotsman who was involved with early banking systems in France, since we speak of France, what would Adam Smith, do you think, have made of this?
Well, of course, he's famous, most famous, I suppose, for the invisible hand. And the wonderful thing about the invisible hand of the price mechanism is that it's providing you constantly with updates as to what's going on in real time, in terms of either relative excesses or relative shortages of goods and services and labor in different parts of an economy. The marvelous thing about it is that it beats central planning hands down and always has done. So in that sense, it's very, very useful. The problem with inflation, although I'm not sure that Smith addressed this directly, but the problem with inflation is that because it tends to be quite volatile, it effectively distorts the invisible hand. It means that people can't quite really gauge what's going on in terms of changes in one price against another, sometimes because contracts are shifted at different times of the year. So one person's wage settlement might be in April, another person's wage settlement might be in September. The price of beer might go up in June. I mean, all these things tend to move around in a kind of ratchet effect. And because you don't know exactly which prices are going to move and when, you're confused during an inflationary period as to what is real in terms of shortages and excesses and what is just an imaginary story. And this in turn makes it very difficult for businesses to plan. It means they become typically more cautious. And it also helps to explain why, once inflation is established, the economy itself tends to underperform, because once you've got all this confusing noise going on in terms of prices, then whether it's companies or individuals, the process of planning for the future just becomes much more difficult, and that damages the sort of underlying productive potential of the economy.
Poonam, you're someone with first-hand knowledge of having to wrestle with these challenges running a global business as you do. What would your observations be and your questions to Stephen?
I'm actually really privileged to be speaking to Stephen today. And some of the things you've said, I'll start with, you mentioned the confusing noises in terms of prices. This is exactly what I have been witnessing in business in last, at least I would say 4 months. So you mentioned about, let's start from 2020, when COVID basically started surfacing and the market prices started going down, but I'd say about 20%. And that I could understand partially, as people were more focused on immediate goods, goodness, necessary goods, I'd say, and paper doesn't remain a product which is basic necessity globally now. And then suddenly this year, then after another 6 months or so, the prices started to increase, and they increased not just by 20-30%, which was the original fall, they more than doubled and trebled in certain rates. And recently, the trend has been, we're talking about inflation, but interestingly, in the paper industry, the prices are actually at all-time low. I would say they are at a level they were at 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis hit. So I'd love to hear from you that this whole confusing noises where prices continue to fall, and yet, we are facing this critical inflation, which is being talked about at least since end of last year, if not earlier. I would love to hear from you. What's your take on that?
Well, the first thing to emphasize is that inflation obviously is a sort of measure of the general price level. It's all prices. Consumer price inflation is prices of all consumer goods. When it comes to paper and packaging, some of that might be captured in the producer price indices rather than the consumer price indices. And of course, you've got separate issues like, for example, what's happening in the service sector, where we know in the UK that wage growth has been really quite robust over the course of the last couple of years. So one of the striking things about all periods of inflation, I would suggest, is that you can get some very big winners and losers being created. During a period of inflation, some prices will go up a long way, some prices will fall. Prices that may come down might be particularly sensitive to changes in interest rates. So if a central bank or policymaker is trying to secure a slowdown in the economy to try to get on top of inflation, there are some early industries which are likely to be hit harder than others. It's been striking over the last year or so, for example, that producer price inflation in general has fallen quite a long way, even as consumer price inflation has taken on a life of its own to a certain degree, and wage inflation is even stronger. So one of the themes of the book is this idea that inflation does create, in a sort of arbitrary fashion, both winners and losers. It creates winners and losers in terms of those industries that can push price increases through, even against the background of prices falling elsewhere. It creates winners and losers in labor markets where a strongly unionized workforce may find that it can negotiate a big pay settlement to offset the inflationary hit it's already suffered. Whereas if you're an individual without union membership, you may discover that you are much more vulnerable in those circumstances. And it also creates winners and losers in terms of debtors versus creditors. In the sort of traditional sense, if you're a debtor, you quite like inflation because inflation effectively reduces the real value of the debts that you've taken out. But simultaneously, and effectively the other side of the coin really is the idea that if you're a creditor, you lent money, the money that's then repaid to you is worth less than it was when you lent it in the first place. Now, generally speaking, interest rates should rise to compensate you for these changes in inflation, but typically interest rates don't rise perfectly lockstep with the changes in inflation. So what's been striking over the last 2 or 3 years, for example, is that interest rates have gone up quite a long way, but not as far as inflation rose. So real interest rates actually remain quite negative, particularly in the UK, which effectively is a sort of message to say that if you're a creditor, so in other words, if you've got savings in your bank, for example, in real terms, you're losing money each and every single year. Whereas if you borrow from the bank and you haven't got a sudden sort of terrible mortgage shock coming your way, of course, some people will have a terrible mortgage shock coming their way. If you borrow from the bank, you may discover that the amount you're having to repay is less in real terms than you had anticipated. So this idea of winners and losers of a relative series of different stories is a really important one for all inflationary episodes.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned central banks and you're explaining interest rates. But when I look at interest rates as a net borrower for my business, I'm seeing these interest rates higher than ever before. At least I haven't seen these high levels of interest rates, which we are borrowing at in last 2 decades. And as a business, these interest rates are now affecting our bottom line. It's eating into the market is already very, very difficult. And like I mentioned, in our particular industry where prices are falling, the supply chain, I wouldn't say consumer confidence because we don't really sell directly to consumers. We are a B2B business, but the businesses on the other end, our buyers are holding back on orders because every day the prices are falling. And again, coming back to I think this will be the theme for me today, the confusing noises in terms of pricing is making them hold back. And yet my borrowing rate is higher than ever before. So as a business, I'm struggling to, strike that balance and, trying to see the good side of this higher interest rates as borrowers. So I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Well, as a borrower, higher rates generally, there isn't much of a good side. It's sort of different levels of pain, I suppose. And particularly if you're in an industry whereby you have no pricing power, and it sounds at the moment as though you have no pricing power, then you are, sorry to say, in the worst of all worlds, whereby your prices are falling and the borrowing costs themselves are going up. And of course, monetary policy does not really discriminate between those parts of the economy which have rampant inflation and those parts that have no inflation or possibly deflation. You're just left with the same nominal cost of borrowing in all cases. However, I would point to the Larry Summers quote on the book, because of course he's saying most people are too young to remember when inflation was last a problem. And I think you're too young. I mean, I don't mean that in a sort of patronizing way, but you're luckily too young, in the sense that if you go back to the 1970s and 1980s, nominal interest rates were incredibly high. And I think that if you were to sort of point the finger of blame on this, I would argue that central bankers themselves, not that they would admit this, but central bankers themselves kind of really bought into the idea that we're living in a permanently deflationary environment before the onset of the pandemic, a bit like Japan. And a permanently deflationary environment requires permanently low interest rates. So, we built a world over the pre-pandemic years, which was entirely based on the idea that not just inflation would be low, but interest rates themselves would be at rock bottom almost indefinitely. And what I think we are returning to in a very uncomfortable fashion is a world whereby to secure inflation at 2%, which is the target that central banks have, to manage to do that, you're having to have much higher short-term interest rates than seemed plausible before the onset of the pandemic. Now, the hope, of course, is that if inflation comes down to 2 and stays there, then, of course, interest rates can then come swiftly back down again. And to be fair, the IMF wrote a report a little earlier this year, which was suggesting we could easily return to those kinds of conditions after this inflationary blip, if you might describe it in those terms. But while you're going through the blip, while it's happening, I think it is it's very difficult for the central bank to allow interest rates to come back down again. And the lesson here really is that it is easier in one sense to say we'll put up with a bit more inflation to avoid a recession. And you can understand why people would think that, and that was very much the thinking of the 1970s. But the problem with doing that is that once inflation is embedded, it is so unfair within society by creating these winners and losers in terms of income inequality, in terms of creditors versus debtors. It becomes a toxic process that leads to mistrust within society. And as that builds, eventually people say, enough is enough. And actually, if you wanted to have an example of that, actually 2 examples from the 1970s and 1980s. The first in the US was the fact that in the 1970s, inflation was tolerated. And then in the 1980s, with the advent of Paul Volcker arriving at the Federal Reserve, actually he arrived in the late 1970s, suddenly inflation, people have finally recognized that defeating inflation was a necessary precondition of returning to economic health elsewhere in terms of, say, unemployment or decent economic growth. And then the other example is Margaret Thatcher. And regardless of what you think of Thatcher, in terms of person of tremendous evil or otherwise, she was elected partly because the policies of the 1970s, both for Tories and Labour, hadn't really worked, and she had made it a priority to get rid of inflation. Now, it was an extraordinarily painful experience, and you'd hope that independent central banks would find it easier to deliver on these outcomes than elected politicians, where there's always a fear of a U-turn. But nevertheless, I think it's worth stressing that the longer you allow inflation to persist, the more painful it becomes for society. And eventually you may have to have an even bigger recession to get rid of it than would have been the case if you tackled inflation straight away.
So take on that point, what's your next 5-year view on inflation? Do you see that, we'll see the things improving, or how long, till the trends change? For most businesses that I speak to, it's actually most businesses say it is now even more difficult than it was during COVID period, for example.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear from you on this point.
Yeah, and I think it probably would be, because during the COVID period, well, I don't know. I mean, during the COVID period, there was such uncertainty. You didn't know exactly what's going to happen from one month to the next at all. Now we're in a slightly more sort of traditional setting in one sense economically, but we're having to tackle something that hasn't really had to be tackled for decades. But the lesson from these periods of high inflation is that when you do tackle them, it's costly. The economy slows down. You might have a recession in terms of businesses. A lot of them will see squeezed profit margins, and it's tough. But having said that, I would argue that there are effectively two risks out there. I think the first risk is the idea that central banks do achieve their inflation targets, but they really hammer the economies hard in doing so. So then you have a sort of hard landing story associated with the reduction in inflation, which frankly a lot of people understandably don't really want. The other alternative is that actually central banks themselves believe they haven't really got the political support to deliver this kind of outcome, which is, frankly, a reasonable conclusion, you might say. And if they haven't got the political support, then actually we as society begin to tolerate higher inflation than used to be the case. And there's been quite a lot of talk, particularly in academic circles, as to whether central banks should be given higher inflation targets, maybe 3% or 4% or 5% rather than 2%. And were you to go down that route, in effect, what you'd be saying is, well, we used to have inflation targets of 2 because it was easy. Now, not so easy to get to 2. Therefore, we're going to accommodate higher inflation in the future than we have done in the past. But if that happens, you're going to end up with higher nominal interest rates on a semi-permanent basis. And I think also you're going to end up in a situation whereby, again, because higher inflation can be more volatile, you will do damage to the economy on a longer term basis if you go back to that kind of story.
So this is what I saw in last 2 years in terms of 2020, I would say in the beginning, first 6 months, very uncertain. Obviously, there was no vaccination. It was still about what do we do? How do we tackle COVID? Lockdowns all across the world. And I could understand why the consumer confidence was low, because like I said, people were spending money on what was most important. And then come the next 6 months, we started hearing about these freight rates going up phenomenally. And I think you often talk about emerging markets, you talk about globalization, sometimes in a negative way as well, saying, is this the end of globalization? China is such an important supplier in the world, where it's like from needle to sometimes very important tech equipment is coming from China, textiles are coming from China. And during COVID, what we were finding was lack of availability of even transport from China. And if it was available, sometimes when I was speaking to businesses, it was at a price which was like 4 times the actual cost of goods which were going into these containers. And the businesses were sometimes often making decisions to say, we are not going to import simply because we can't charge our buyer 4 times the price of what we've been charging them before. We can't afford it. So when, I used to think about as a business about inflation and rising prices, it became quite clear that, if a container was costing you $2,000, just end of 2019, and it went up to $25,000. And even if then you would get one, you would be lucky, then it was kind of a no-brainer to think if somebody's importing textiles or garments, it's going to impact them hugely. And then we talk about multiple goods in consumer markets, which are maybe high density goods, low, not high in weight, but high density, which means the prices all add up. So it became quite clear that we were importing inflation because Britain, we import a lot of our goods from China. Supply chains were affected. There was scarcity in the market of goods that the people needed. But then came a point where freight rates, which was predicted that, come 2022 end, the freight rate should start coming back down, which happened. But yet it seems that inflation continues to rise, which doesn't suddenly make sense anymore.
Yeah, well,
so I thought, since I have you, I should put this question to you. Why is this happening? What is happening?
So this is basically the second round effects. It's things like wage increases beginning to come through. So I mean, the UK has a higher inflation rate than many others. And if you were to try to work out why, the most obvious proximate reason is that wages are rising more quickly in the UK than they are elsewhere. And then you ask the question, why is that happening? Well, it's not really unions, maybe a little bit in the public sector, but it's nothing like what was true in the 1970s. I would suggest a number of factors. The first is that Bank of England kept telling us that inflation was transitory. So I think people behaved as if interest rates wouldn't go up and it wouldn't be too painful. So there was a willingness to pay out higher wages than would otherwise be the case. The second factor, this is not a political point, but I do think that Brexit has not been helpful, because although migration into the UK has continued at pace, it's been a different kind of migrant. In effect, pre-COVID, pre-Brexit, in fact, it's very easy to hire people from Poland or Romania or Bulgaria or whatever, relatively cheap labor that could fill low productivity jobs in particular the service sector, notably areas like hotels and restaurants. And interestingly, those are areas that have tremendous shortages now of labor and where wage inflation has been quite pronounced. So I think that's had an impact as well. And the third factor, and this is really a story about our commitment to health care in the UK, is that the number of people signed off on long-term sickness in the UK has gone up hugely post-COVID, more so than elsewhere. Now, I was looking at some data, I think only released today, I haven't looked at it in any detail, but suggesting that a lot of this is issues associated with anxiety and mental health and other bits and pieces. But whatever it is, it appears that the UK has had a bigger issue here than other countries. And certainly if you're in the Bank of England, you will say that labour market shortages have made a bigger contribution in the UK than elsewhere. And the consequence of that is that you find that UK wages have been rising rapidly compared with countries elsewhere. And that, of course, means that it's more difficult to get inflation back down. So put it very simply, if your inflation target is 2, which it is, if you've got wages rising at 7%, which they are, you need to have huge amounts of productivity gains to justify those wage increases to then meet the inflation target. And unfortunately, in the UK, we do not have huge productivity gains. So the big increases in pay, no productivity growth. The only things that can happen in those circumstances are either that businesses get very heavily squeezed, so profits get hit pretty hard, or alternatively, businesses are able to pass on the wage cost in terms of higher prices, in which case you end up with a kind of wage price spiral of the kind that would have been seen in, say, the 1970s. So it's a messy situation we're in at the moment, I'm afraid. And I think that it's partly because the bank chose for such a long time to say inflation wasn't a problem, didn't issue enough sort of yellow and red cards in terms of interest rate increases straight away, and gave the impression that people could behave as they wanted to behave, irrespective of the longer term consequences, and got it wrong, unfortunately.
Stephen, as we spend a lot of our time looking at Asia, as the Asia-Scotland Institute and the Pan-Asian markets, which markets would you say within Asia have got it right or are managing it? I mean, would Vietnam be one that seems to be growing very rapidly? Would China be one that wasn't doing so well because of the complete lockdown that it had? How would you view Japan? Are there differences across?
There are differences. So if I may, I will focus on China and Japan, because Japan, in one sense, has seen a sort of inflation story beginning to emerge that is very different from its recent history, because of course Japan's had deflation for 30 years or so. B is more in keeping with the experience we've seen in the Western world. So Japan has got some inflation. It's had faster wage increases it's had in many a year, if not a decade. And it's put the Bank of Japan into a slightly odd position, because of course it kind of is thinking maybe we should be raising interest rates, but I think is afraid that by doing so, it would really harm the sort of government's debt sustainability position, because of course, Japanese government debt is through the roof compared with most other countries. And that was sustainable so long as interest rates themselves remained at very, very low rates. But if they have to go up, then those calculations begin to look a little more worrisome. So I think at the moment, the Bank of Japan is sort of hoping and praying that this will not be a persistent problem. As for China, I think that the difference between China and the West is not just about lockdowns, although that is part of it. I think it is also that the Chinese, in hindsight, felt that they had overstimulated after the global financial crisis. Effectively, shortly after the crisis, you had the Germans, the Americans, and the Chinese all providing support to their economies in the hope of providing support to the global economy. But only the Chinese persisted with this. And the Chinese, as a consequence, ended up with a profoundly overheating property market, which was not in their long-term interest. So when it came to 2020, when COVID hit hard, I think China's view was, we don't really want to offer too much in the way of stimulus because we were in danger of repeating the errors we made effectively 8-9 years earlier. If you think about the amount of stimulus that the West provided in terms of huge increases in budget deficits, big increases in government debt, huge amounts of money printing in 2020, none of that really happened in China. So it goes back to this idea that it's not just about a global shock that was true for everyone. It was also, how did you respond to that global shock in terms of policy? How much stimulus did you provide? And when you had to withdraw that stimulus, how much of that did you withdraw? And I would suggest that the West, it was collectively didn't fully learn the lessons from the 1970s, whereas the Chinese did learn the lessons from the sort of 2010s and decided we're not going to go down this path again. So I think lockdown certainly plays a part of the story, but I don't think it's the only factor. I think the amount of stimulus provided helps to distinguish the Chinese story of very low inflation from the Western story, which is, of course, of unusually high inflation.
Good, thank you. Sorry, Poonam, I wanted to just take some questions from the participants.
Okay, no worries. Thanks.
And then we'll come back to you in a second. There's a question here, which is as follows. If you take the amount of public debt in the market plus QE on the Bank of England's balance sheet and the discounted liabilities of pay as you go government to government pensions, central government debt is 20% GDP in the UK. Is the only way out
20 times GDP.
It's what, 25?
20 times GDP, yeah.
Yeah, 20 times GDP, sorry. Is the only way out of this for the government to inflate their way out of it? And how should they do this? That's a question.
Well, it's a very interesting one, because traditionally you would say absolutely, if you've got a big fiscal deficit and high levels of government debt, then inflation is your usual friend. Oddly enough, the Office of Budget Responsibility investigated precisely this issue a couple of weeks back. I wrote an article about it in the Times last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago. And what they were saying was that this is an unusual kind of inflation because effectively consumer price inflation, retail price inflation is higher than wage inflation. And that matters because income tax revenues depend largely on wage inflation, whereas benefits in terms of pensions and social benefits, and also the payout on index-linked gilts depend much more on either RPI or CPI, which are higher. So the UK finds itself in an unusual position where normally you would say higher inflation helps the fiscal numbers, but currently that's not happening. That might change. I mean, if for example, headline inflation falls relative to wage growth, then what's bad news this year will be better news next year. That will be helpful. But at the moment, we haven't seen much of that. But certainly from the past, you'd normally think that big increases in government debt, which are difficult to deal with in terms of raising taxes any further or cutting back public spending, the chances are you're eventually going to resort to the printing press to bail yourself out. But as I say, the UK is a rather unusual case at the moment.
Okay, here's a question, 2 questions from Martin Allen. The first is, do you think academic circles are now the cause of speculative inflation, and inflation is now created for profit while reducing production? The risk is removal of the gold standard, the collapse of the petrodollar, and non-tangible market speculation on phantoms. And the other point Martin's raised is there not a shortage of property in China and also a shortage of people who can afford property prices? Well, that second one is certainly true. Yeah,
the second one's definitely true. I think one has to think here about the different attitudes of property development in China compared with other parts of the emerging world. So you either build too much property, which is what China tends to do, or you build too little, in which case you end up with the favelas of Sao Paulo or the slums of Mumbai. I mean, it's a tricky one to get right because you either overbuild, you underbuild. You very rarely build at the pace that keeps everybody happy. As for the inflation story, well, here's a little fact, which is that the 100 years of the 20th century in the UK saw the biggest destruction of monetary value of any century over the last 1,000 years. So a pound in 1900 was worth only 2p 100 years later. And of course, this coincides with Britain leaving the gold standard in the 1930s. And thereafter, you either had high inflation or low inflation, but you never had the kind of deflation that you had seen in earlier centuries. So this is a very different kind of period. Now, the good news, you might say, is that even though we've had a lot of inflation, living standards equally have risen rapidly over the last 100 years or so. So that's all rather encouraging. But you still come back to the problem of the fact that persistent inflation, when you have high inflation, can be quite damaging, as it was in the 1970s and 1980s, and also can be very redistributional in arbitrary and non-democratic ways. As for speculation, well, if we go back to the pre-COVID period when interest rates were at rock bottom, when central banks appeared to be promising they would stay at rock bottom forevermore, this did encourage a lot of speculation. And one of the areas of speculation that I suppose is most obvious is cryptocurrency of one kind or another, that people bought this stuff not because it actually had any kind of true asset value in terms of being reflective of a real underlying asset. It was purely speculative, and the fact that it was so speculative suggested, in my view, that interest rates were probably too low. And I think in hindsight, many others would probably agree with me.
Thanks. Yeah, okay. And there's a question here, well, Hugh Rose makes a point. Why do we have an inflation target of 2%? Surely it would be better to aim for a nil inflation rate. Well, yes, probably.
So the reason why we have a 2% target is largely because of this fear of deflation, that if you're at zero and you have an economic downswing and you want to have negative interest rates real interest rates to support you during the downswing, it's very difficult to achieve that when you've got inflation at zero. And you can have slightly negative nominal rates, but the underlying problem is that as long as we've got notes and coin in circulation, they always give you a zero nominal interest rate. So in a situation where you try to sort of impose negative nominal rates on bank deposits, all that happens is people will take their money out of the banks, and the banks will collapse, and you end up in a terrible, terrible mess. So the reason why we have a 2% target rather than zero is because of this fear of deflation. Having said that, it is worth stressing that not all deflations are bad. I think one of the errors that policymakers have made over the last 100 years or so is to assume that all deflations are like the 1930s deflation. But in actual fact, there's another very good example of deflation which was entirely positive, and that was the deflation of the late 19th century under the gold standard. And during that period, prices fell relative to wages and relative to profits. So effectively, people were becoming better off because prices were declining relative to their nominal incomes, and that's a perfectly sustainable situation. But as I say, because of this fear of other forms of deflation, notably debt deflation, that's why you have inflation targets at 2 rather than 0.
Stephen, and on this side of the Atlantic, there's great sort of debates about Bidenomics and whether it's working and whether it's not. It looks like inflation is actually settling a little bit here in the States. To what extent do things like major infrastructure spending programs impact beneficially and the creation of new green technology jobs?
So I'm a little bit hesitant about this because I think that the US certainly has done better than the UK, but how much of it is associated with these infrastructure spending plans or whatever, I think is slightly more debatable. I mean, you could arguably say that there have been subsidies paid out by the US which have kept certain prices lower than they otherwise would be, which of course has helped to restrain inflation to a degree. Yeah, in terms of the longer term effects of these kinds of programs, you need to know what they do in terms of productivity for the economy. And here I think the jury is probably still out. For me, the main reason why two reasons why the US has been better than Europe in terms of inflation. The first reason is most obviously that the US was not as affected by the increase in energy prices as the Europe was because of its proximity to Ukraine. And the second factor is that the Federal Reserve abolished the transitory language much earlier than the Bank of England, and actually the ECB for that matter. So it was late in 2021 that Jay Powell said, look, actually, we're getting this wrong. Inflation is more embedded than we thought. It kind of gave the sense that interest rates would have to rise quite a long way to sort the problem out. Whereas I think the message from the Bank of England in particular, and to a lesser degree the ECB, was still a sense of denial that this wasn't really a serious inflation problem. It was only caused by external events, nothing to do with domestic policies, and it wouldn't require much in the way of monetary tightening. So I think the message from quite an early stage was more hawkish in the US than it was in Europe. And that may have helped to subdue inflationary pressure from what otherwise had been the case.
Thank you. Poonam, back to you. You've been listening to Stephen and some of the questions that have been asked. How do you feel about what you've heard, and what other questions might you have?
Well, I could actually speak to Stephen for hours, because for businesses, it's fascinating to understand economics so we can work out the trends and how we can strategize going forward. It is so important for businesses to strategize, for what we are going to do now, present and future. But so one of my questions would be, we've been facing uncertainty after uncertainty since 2019. I think I would say in the UK particularly, it started with Brexit, and it just seems to continue. So what would be your advice to how businesses must strategize to create, resilience?
So I think there are sort of lessons from engineering. I think that economists tend to sort of give you a view as to what's going to happen, as if they have a crystal ball. Actually, we don't have crystal balls at all. We have guesses as to what might happen in the future. And in terms of scenario planning, you have to think quite carefully about quite a wide range of scenarios and attach some kind of subjective probability to each of them. But one thing I would observe, for example, is that let's take an example actually from earlier this year, not in the UK, but it's in the US. I could be neutral on this, but when you had the regional banking crisis in the US, it was partly born out of the idea that these banks had funded themselves at remarkably low interest rates, because that's where interest rates had been. And no one had really asked the question, would they still be profitable if interest rates had to rise to 4 or 5%, which is, of course, what happened. So sometimes when it comes to stress tests, you have to imagine a wider range of scenarios than is part of the current consensus. So in 2019, 2020, although most people thought interest rates would remain at rock bottom forevermore, there'd be no inflation whatsoever, I think given the nature of the shock that was coming through, it would have been wise at the time to have said, well, actually, let's imagine that inflation does pick up, does persist. How would the world look differently to how it's looking currently? You wouldn't have been encouraged to do that by central banks, because they were all sort of the view that inflation wouldn't be a problem. But I think that given where we were starting from, given the oddity of the shock, given the risk of a supply side sort of shock coming through, that would be the wise thing to have done. As for today, if you take the consensus at the moment in terms of forecasts, it's kind of inflation comes down to 2 within a couple of years' time, that we have a sort of softish landing for the economies, and we can all live happily ever after. I would argue that relative to that consensus, there are certainly 2 things you should definitely be thinking about. The first I've already mentioned is the idea that inflation itself is much more persistent, so it hangs around for a long time. And the second is imagine how things would be if there was a deep recession. Because, as I say, the central forecasts typically are quite cozy. It's the stuff that's around those central forecasts that is more worrisome. I'd also probably look through the history books. My last book I wrote back in 2017, Grave New World, was subtitled The End of Globalization and the Return of History. And I think we had the view, many people had the view, shared view, particularly since the Berlin Wall came down, that globalization was sort of one-way traffic, that technology and so on was going to push this to advance more and more and more. And I think looking through the history books, maybe what happens during the First World War and thereafter, what happens, I don't know. That would be the good one to start with, really. But the world thinks that globalization continues, but what happens when it goes into reverse? How do you think about the world of borders and barriers being rebuilt? About pressure for national resilience, which is a kind of euphemism for protectionism. All these kinds of things that have returned as part of the narrative today that wouldn't have been there 10 years ago. How do you think about the fact that Washington and Beijing are in danger of not being busy mates, so to speak, they're in danger of falling out with each other. And then thinking about, well, if China and the US have a weaker relationship, how does the rest of the world reset itself in those circumstances? So there are a lot of questions out there that are worth considering. I don't have the answers to these things, but scenario planning at least allows you to think about some of these issues in ways that don't come from looking just at the consensus.
It has been an extremely intriguing session, and you've been phenomenal, imparting the knowledge that you have. And of course, you aren't a celebrated author for nothing and an economist. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's the other one.
From you. That absolute pleasure. So, I still have a list of questions, Roddy, if you want me to keep going, or I shall pass it on to you.
Well, thank you. We're drawing towards the end of our hour, and I have got a question, which is that with the eventual ending of the war in Ukraine, are we going to look at something like the rebuilding of Europe that occurred after World War II? And will that create lots of opportunities, even for businesses like Poonam's, as presumably Ukraine is able to build a newer, better, brighter model than the rest of us have? And related to that, I suppose, and that will be a subject that we're going to be looking at next month, the impact of AI. And should we be worried about that? And can we harness it to the benefit of everybody? So the Marshall Plan, sort of, in Ukraine, or whatever it will be called, and AI as elements. And then after that, you've answered that, we'll draw a conclusion.
So the Marshall Plan was created in response to a fear that the Soviet Union at the time was not just embarking on sort of the sort of control of Eastern Europe, but was effectively looking for opportunities to head westwards. And the argument was that unless the West stabilized economies in West Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, then the spread of Soviet-style communism would be relentless, and the Soviets would encourage that particular process. So the Marshall Plan was really to change the incentives in Western Europe to not go down the communist route. Now, of course, it was a great plan for other reasons, and it did lead to extraordinary growth and the recovery in Germany and elsewhere. But I would hazard a guess that whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia is not intent on the same sort of grand plan that it apparently had been intent on as the Soviets in the late 1940s. So I think the similarities are beginning to break down there. I'd also note that for all of the awfulness that Ukraine's been through, Ukraine as a sort of rebuild project is small compared with the sort of rebuild projects that were happening in Western Europe in the aftermath of World War II. So that's not to belittle the experiences that people in Ukraine have had. It's simply to say that the story itself is a little bit smaller scale. I also wonder exactly how things will work out, because on the one hand, you might say, well, if Ukraine is no longer a sort of buffer state, if it's a bit more like Poland has become, then there's an opportunity for tremendous growth to come through in Ukraine. But if it isn't a buffer state, then the question is, where is there a buffer state at all? Or have we now got a situation whereby we have eventually, NATO troops in Ukraine, effectively guarding the border directly with Russia, which feels more like a sort of Cold War, nasty Cold War kind of story. I'd also add that, of course, this is a fiscal and inflationary issue, that we've lived through this last 30, 40-year period of supposedly having a peace dividend. The idea was that spending less on defense meant you could spend more on other things. But one lesson surely that comes from this particular conflict is that the Western world may have to spend more on defense. It puts even more budgetary pressure on these countries than they've been under for really quite some time. So that might mean higher real rates. It might mean higher taxes, more borrowing, but certainly not the kind of beautiful world we appear to be living in for the last 30 or 40 years. As for AI, well, I could be an AI bot, couldn't I? I'm not. I'm a real thing as far as I'd like me to believe. But I think what's been troubling for economists in general, and actually for policymakers too, is that we know over the last 10, 15, 20 years that there'll be extraordinary technological innovations. I mean, on one side, the specifics of AI, we can see it in every aspect of what we do, like the Zoom call would be unthinkable 20 years ago. So you couldn't do this sort of stuff. So we can see it all around us, this technology that's changing and changing our lives in pretty fundamental ways. But the odd thing is, it doesn't really come through in the productivity data in the way that you would expect. Productivity gains have been very, very soft. And I would argue that, and this may be consistent with the AI story, that technology, rather than adding to productivity and hence living standards, has acted more so far as a redistributional device. It has redistributed income away from labor towards capital. It has weakened labor's negotiating position in many cases. It's replaced labor in some cases. And if that trend continues, then I think we have some really big questions to ask about winners and losers in the future, and how our societies hang together when AI has the capacity for destroying huge numbers of industries which are often regionally located. And one of the big things we've experienced in recent times is precisely this idea that we look at economies in aggregate and think, well, what's happening here and what's happening there? But what's striking is that the regional divides have become bigger and bigger. So in the UK, if you look at people who voted for Brexit, the majority, not all, but the majority typically came from regions of Britain that had been left behind, that had not done as well as other regions. So flourishing regions tended to vote to remain, and left behind regions tended to vote for Brexit. If you take France, the regions that have advanced have tended to be happy to vote for people like Macron. The areas left behind, particularly regional, rural areas, have often, or deindustrialized areas, have often voted for people like Le Pen. So to the extent that technology has an impact on the distribution of income regionally within countries, it also has an impact on the political choices that those countries make.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. And Poonam, I want to also thank you for, as an owner and an entrepreneur, you've brought alive this topic. And I'm pleased that Stephen's answers were helpful to you. So that there is the book, and you went the right way around. I don't quite understand. Yeah, so buy the book. I think it's well worth reading, and it's extremely well written. I'm not saying that because the author's there, but I know that in your BBC conversation yesterday, you were told that he'd read half of the book, I think. Is that right?
It was CNN, but yes, he had read half of it, which I think
CNN.
he might have been being economical with the truth about, but nevertheless, he had read some of it.
That's good. So we're very, very grateful to you. Funny enough, on August the 9th, we got Eamon Butler talking about Adam Smith in the context of a talk that he gave in South Korea. So that will be interesting to hear. And on the subject of AI, artificial intelligence, in the middle of August, working with University of Edinburgh and also with the Brookings Institution, we've got speakers and panelists on the subject of AI. But thank you to both of you for having made this webinar session extremely interesting, as I'm sure everybody would agree, very thought-provoking, and we're very, very grateful to you for your time and your efforts. Thank you.